Yes. Okay. So I hope everyone is okay with being recorded. I'm going to share my screen so we can get started. Okay, everyone. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Yes. Okay, perfect. All right. All right. So welcome all of you again. Make sure I have this. Okay. To understanding inclusive pedagogy at American University, the role of anti-racism. Before we get started, just a few things that some of the more knowledgeable other and people who do this work really well always tell me, and that's just to take a breath and breathe, right? This work is ongoing. I mean, it's continuous. It never stops. And so today we're going to dialogue around inclusive practices and anti-racism, and we're going to interact with each other and reflect and find where our learning edge is and push that. So let's just take a breath. Okay. So really today's workshop is inspired by, many of you may know or may not know that, as I mentioned, I am the Senior Research Fellow here at American University in the Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning. And in part of I've just transitioned into a new role, and part of my new role has to deal with thinking about anti-racism. And so it is to support AU leadership in learning about anti-racism here at AU, and what does anti-racism look like? What does it mean to be anti-racist? How does it show up in your classrooms, your departments, or your colleges? And so this encompasses learning from you. So all of you are critical and essential to unpacking this and grappling with this, right? So today we're going to engage in dialogue with you and learn from you and with you about doing inclusive and anti-racist work. And so for me, this looks like serving as a resource to support AU leadership to learn about anti-racism. But it also, again, starts with you, because a lot of this is anchored in the work and the practices that you're already doing. And so together, we need to begin to collectively think about what are our inclusive and supportive practices that we're currently engaged in, and connecting that to anti-racism. And then being an expert. So I have expertise. Many of you may know that I am a science educator, and I use critical perspectives to think about the best ways to support the persistence of Black men and Black PhD scientists. And so I found that part of using critical lens is that, it really helps me to understand their voices. And part of understanding what anything is, or making sense of anything like anti-racism, is to make sure that you're inviting the voices of those that are doing the work. So in the same vein, I want us to begin to build a community of practice, and to collectively engage and to critically reflect upon our practices to build inclusive and anti-racist teaching and learning communities. So I want to just share with you a few norms for engagement for social justice. Some of you may have seen these things, but it's really important that if we want to do this work, that we have some ideas or some principles to help to guide us. And so as you guys, please take a moment to read through these, and I'll just touch upon them just briefly. So we want to strive for intellectual humility and be willing to grapple with challenging ideas. We want to be able to differentiate between opinion, which everyone has, and informed knowledge, right? And we want to hold our opinions lightly and with humility. We also want to let go of personal anecdotal evidence and look at broader group level patterns. We want to be aware of our own defensive reactions and attempt to use these reactions as entry points, right? For guiding ourselves to deeper self-knowledge, rather than as a rationale for just shutting down and closing off. We want to recognize our own positionality as researchers, which encompasses thinking about race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability, and use these perspectives and these reactions, to help us to do this work, right? We want to differentiate between safety and comfort, and just understand and accept that discomfort is necessary for social justice change. And we want to identify where our learning edge is and just push it, to continue to push ourselves and to challenge ourselves. And I hope that we will be able to do this in today's session. So when we think about inclusion at AU, what is inclusion at AU, right? So as faculty and staff, it's important for us to think about how we all come to this work, right? Because how we come to this work as teachers, as faculty, as staff, as educators, really impacts our teaching and our students' learning. And so, I want to take this opportunity to understand what it is that people are doing and for us to engage in dialogue. So I want to break us out into small groups to discuss a few guiding questions. So Nazia, can you help us to do that?
Yeah, sounds good.
Oops. 1, 2. I'm going to drop the questions in the chat, everyone. The first question is, in our roles as faculty, staff, and administrators, what does it mean to you to be inclusive, and how does that show up in your teaching? The second question is, how do you understand or experience inclusive or inclusion, personally or professionally? And then the third question is, where did you get the information necessary to develop your understanding of the term inclusive? So really just wanting us to think about, again, how do we come to this work and how does that show up in your teaching? So if we can just begin to dialogue around this, and we can take about 10 minutes to think about these 3 sets of questions, and then we'll come back and share out and have a larger group discussion around people's responses. So Nazia, I want to drop these questions in the chat.
Okay, we may have to go into the groups and drop it. If you drop it in the chat here, I can copy paste it into each group.
I'm trying to get back to, let me see. I'm trying to get to the larger screen to do that.
Oh, if you go to the little screen, there's like a little green arrow.
I don't. Green arrow?
Did your Zoom become like a little box in the corner?
Yeah, it did. And the only options I have are the little blue dots, the 2 lines, the bigger line, and the 1 line. So I'm just like,
There's no exit minimized view, like a green arrow.
No, I don't see that, but I'm going to, can I drop this into the Teams?
Sure,
Okay.
yeah, that works, yeah.
Okay, wait a minute. Oh, I see it right here. Look, okay, I'm gonna paste these in. And do you see that?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I'll just.
I'm gonna paste, I don't know if everyone's gonna get it, right? Because they're in different.
Yeah, I can just go into the groups and paste it there. Just give me one.
Okay. I'm trying to see. Then I want to go to the groups. Welcome back, everyone. I was able to pop into most, I think, all of the discussion, and there was really rich discussion. I heard a lot of people really talking about how they come to this term inclusion and how it shows up. So if we could maybe get, a response from each group, that would be great in terms of, if not each of the questions, at least one of the questions. Who wants to start?
So, hi.
Hey, Tracy.
Hi. So I was just saying that pre-pandemic, like I always felt like I was doing a great job with inclusion, validating and affirming all my students' lived experiences, lived realities, their ways of being and knowing. And then the pandemic hit. And so all of a sudden inclusion took on a whole nother term. And so there were more aspects and components of it, right? So some of my students were like, I have ADD and it's just so hard for me to stare at a screen for 75 minutes. Or, some students were like, the breakout rooms don't really work for me because I'm not used to speaking up. They don't want to speak in a large group, but they also don't want to speak in a small group. So that was one way I thought I was being inclusive with the breakout rooms, but they caused angst for our more reluctant speakers and participators. And so I think post-pandemic, when we go back in person, like I think the inclusive is what's the word where the term evolves and changes based on situational and contextual. I think it can be situational and contextual. So that was one of the biggest takeaways and learnings that I had from the past 17 months.
Wow, that's really rich. Thank you. Thank you for that.
I think I'm the only one from my group here right now. I don't know how that happened. Oh, there's Jason. Okay, yeah. Jason, how did Stephanie describe her idea of inclusivity? I thought it was really good, and I have already forgotten.
Yeah, I took a note, actually, taking some diligent notes here. She said that when inclusion is a sense of belonging, welcoming students in, calling them by their appropriate name and pronouns, and also acknowledging events that happen in their lives and being sensitive to that, and really just, listening to students.
Yeah, that's right. It was really good. I think one of the things I said in our group was that, like as a white WASPy teacher, the very first thing you do is diversify your readings, right? Like that's like number one, like, who are we studying? Whose voices are we listening to? But then beyond that, I felt like there was this gap between that sort of very basic thing and like to aspire to be successful. And how do you even know? Like, how do you know if you're being successful? That was like, how do you know if you're not being inclusive, if you're doing all these things, if you're, welcoming them and using the right pronouns and asking how their day is, and you've diversified your readings, and then what, problem solved. So that was one of the things that I brought up.
One more response. You guys had so much to say in your small groups, my goodness. It's really nice to pop in and listen to all the rich dialogue that's going on.
I would say from the staff side, how we meet, I'll speak specifically for my office. I work in the office of the Dean of Students, and how we met with students. Of course, we had to pivot, right? And so, we gave the students an option to have like a phone conversation or to meet with us virtually. So we didn't want to add to the Zoom fatigue. And so we wanted to try to give them a couple of different options of virtually meeting. I mean, you're limited, right? But a phone conversation versus having to hop on yet another Zoom. We also gave them the option of doing a Teams meeting with us where they could just take a phone call. Like if we were meeting with an international student, right? We were just trying to think of ways to be inclusive. An international student may not be able to pick up the phone and just call us, right? They probably incur all types of, expenses, international call expenses. So we would send them like a link. So we just pivoted, and we just made use of all of the different virtual platforms that we had, whether it was Skype for Business or Teams, and just gave them the option just to, speak to us, and not have to turn their cameras off. So that was one thing.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's nice to have both the faculty perspective and the staff perspective, because it's really critical. All these experiences are important to our students. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to continue to share my screen, everyone. And so let me make sure that is everyone able to see my screen? Yes, okay. So thank you for sharing these ideas. It's really important, right? So for me, when I think about this term inclusive, a lot of this is anchored in like scholarship, right? And so I think about this in terms of like the perspectives and the frameworks that we use, in our scholarship in the academy. And so there are various frameworks and perspectives that are used in the scholarship to achieve these inclusive classrooms in K through 12 and in higher education. And so this word map highlights some of the various perspectives, and many of them I would say are critical perspectives, right? And so we see here, many of these frameworks I use, they help to inform my teaching, my research, and my service. So we see, anti-racism, culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally sustaining, anti-Blackness, Black feminist thought, Black feminist pedagogy, right? Critical race theory. And so I present this word map because, it's important to understand that independent of the lens, right, of the perspective or the framework that you operate from, oftentimes, and even if you don't have an identified framework, right, that you do have a lens, and that this lens guides your work and informs your teaching, right? So it's really important that we think about, how we come to the work and what are the perspectives and lenses that guide, our teaching when we're talking about being inclusive and thinking about the ways that anti-racism, can be a factor in this, right? So I want to take a few minutes again to break us out into groups and for us to think about and to dialogue. What are the theories, the methodological perspectives or practices or strategies that guide your teaching, right? And so I'm going to break us out again into groups. Yes, Tracy, you have a question.
Sorry, Dr. Watkins, somebody had asked in the chat, could you elaborate on what fugitive means in this context? I just thought that was an interesting question on the
Okay, fugitive. Oh, okay, sure. Like, so here, this word map is a map of some of the critical theoretical perspectives, right? And so Black fugitive pedagogy is a critical framework, and it really looks at the history, using the history of Black people or descendants of Black descendants to inform the present, right? And so there's some really nice work being done around this. Thank you for that. I'm not able to see the chat. Absolutely. Okay. So please, if anyone has any questions, please do interrupt me, because I'm trying to monitor all these things. And so want to make sure that your questions get answered. Okay, so let's break everyone out again so we can think about what theories, practices, perspectives, and strategies guide our teaching. Let's take about 3 minutes to talk about that. And actually, yes, let's take about 3 minutes to talk about that and then come back and share out. I'm going to drop the question again in the chat, everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, are we in breakout groups?
Oh, well, sorry. For some reason you were not assigned. Let me, yeah, here.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Shari, that's my fault. We had one unassigned person and I was trying to assign her to a new group and I,
That's okay. No problem. Welcome back, everyone. All right. So I had the honor of hearing a lot of the discussion around some of the theories and methodological perspectives, or even just practices and strategies that guide your teaching. Does anyone want to share? One or two?
You want me to share? I was telling my group, is that okay?
Oh, it's absolutely.
Yeah, I was telling my group about a technique that I've been using to try to get the students more focused on what's going on in lecture. Remember, I'm in physics and astronomy, than on their phones. And so one of the things that I do is there's a personal response system called iClicker, and they have an app for the cell phone, for a smartphone. And so I keep interrupting my own talking with questions that are up on screen, and they're forced to use the app that's in their hands. They're not getting email or talking on the phone, or I guess texting, because most are kind enough not to talk on the phone, but they'll text away, and you can tell that this way they're actually using an app on that damn cell phone and forcing them to look at what's going on in class up on the screen and questions and activities I'm doing. That's a methodological approach.
Yeah.
No, the iClicker app is not free, but it's not very costly. To be honest, I give iClicker credit. I think it's now $12.99. So for $13, I think it's worth it. And again, it gives them a little bit of a participation feel, and it just, again, try to keep them in the present, in the classroom, looking at what I'm going over, and I will ask questions every few minutes about what I just spoke about, and then also give them some scenarios about what they may think. And I also use it for asking everyone their opinions. And one thing that's nice is you talked about certain people who don't even like to be in breakout rooms, which is kind of amusing, because I was in one of these other talks recently and they're saying, oh, this is so much better. Instead of breaking them up into groups, that they go to separate breakout rooms and they're much more open. And just as you say, some kids aren't. I mean, it's just a personality thing, whether or not they're not more open in a small three. In fact, they're more introverted when you get into a small group, because you can see them more clearly, right? There's only a few people in that group. So what is the app called? The iClick. If you go to I'm not trying to be an advertisement. There are other systems. I just had adapted this. Please don't think this is a commercial advertisement for iClicker. But if you go to iClicker.com, they have their system that is called the iClicker Cloud. And it is where you would find the host application that you have to put on the computer in the classroom, and the students app that they could get for, at least when I was last using it, $12.99. So, and I think it's very reasonable for the cost, especially since what I now like to use in class are the OpenStax textbooks. I don't know if there's one for a subject you may teach or the like, but if you've heard of OpenStax, you know, they have physics and astronomy, and they have others. I'm not familiar with all the others. I'm sorry. I've just used physics and astronomy. But since they don't have to buy an expensive textbook, I think it's fair enough, and it actually relieves them of a higher cost. I mean, I had been teaching in astronomy. The astronomy textbook new is 125. The physics textbook new, I think, is 150. And going with these OpenStax books, again, I'm not advertising. And by the way, OpenStax is a university base. Rice was the one that started this whole thing. And again, the texts are free, so I'm not selling anything. You can download the whole textbook to use free in both astronomy and physics. They're really very good. And so asking them to buy the iClicker app so I can try to avert their attention from their cell phones, I think is a benefit. Just one point of view.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I mean, many of you, you know, I heard a lot of you, different people enacting different practices, and many of you enacting, you know, critical practices. But, you know, it's just really important that we consider, you know, like where we are, our frames of reference, because it really does impact us. You know, if we want to do the work, those things really impact our teaching. And so I'm going to continue to share my slides. Hope you guys can see me. Okay. So thank you for your responses. You know, for me, when I think about theories, methodologies, perspectives, you know, there's several things that guide how I come to this work. And I heard someone talk about in one of the groups using culturally responsive teaching. So there's several frameworks and methodological methodologies that I use, and one of them is culturally responsive teaching. And these things really do kind of guide, you know, how I come to this work. And I know, so for many of us, we will say I use culturally responsive or culturally relevant or anti-racist. But some of us, we are engaging in these practices and we're not often, you know, we may be unfamiliar with the frameworks that's associated, you know, with describing these practices. And that's okay, right? That's okay. And so for me, you know, culturally responsive teaching is one. And I won't go through all the practices. Some of you have attended some of the workshops and have seen me talk about culturally responsive teaching, but, you know, culturally responsive teaching is the work of Dr. Geneva Gay. It has 4 teacher pillars of practice and 8 student outcomes. And we think about using culturally responsive teaching. It's a very prominent framework. We want to think about anti-racist education because it sees the classroom as a site for social change and to make better connections through our teaching and our pedagogy to support our students to be successful in their learning. And so I often find myself as one of the frameworks that I use, but I also use the work of Dr. Gloria Latz-Billings, which is culturally relevant pedagogy, right? And so both of these frameworks, you know, have similarities, but there are also some differences, right? And so culturally relevant pedagogy is the work of Dr. Geneva Gay. There are 3 teacher pillars of practice here and 3 student outcomes. When we think about, you know, these student outcomes, you know, we think about students, how do we help students to be, you know, academically successful? How do we help students to think about and to develop a socio-political consciousness. And when we think about socio-political consciousness, that has to do with our obligation as faculty to help students to recognize and to understand and critique the current and the existing, social inequities. And so it begins with us recognizing how issues of race, class, and gender manifest themselves, and to think about how we can address these issues in our teaching. We also thinking about, with culturally relevant pedagogy, how do we helping students to develop cultural competence. And what is cultural competence? Cultural competence has to deal with helping students to recognize and to honor their own cultural beliefs and practices, while also acknowledging and acquiring knowledge of others, right? And so as a culturally relevant pedagogue, you will understand that students must learn to navigate between home and school, and that as faculty, we have to find ways to help equip students with the knowledge and skills to be successful in a system that often seeks to oppress them. And so these are just two of the frameworks that I use that help to inform my work. There's several others, but these are two of the ones. And so when we think about, as continuing to do this work of inclusion, and thinking about whatever our theories or our frameworks are that help to guide us, for some of us, we're already using critical frameworks. And so for others of us, some of the frameworks or the frames of reference that we use, we need to discard. But it's important that, we consider how can we add new and existing perspectives that can support us in doing this inclusive work. And so this is where we need to reframe, right? And so when we think about reframing is designed as seeing a current situation from a different perspective or lens. And so as faculty and staff, we need to think about ways of how might we reframe, our own lenses to include an anti-racist lens in our teaching. So I want to help us to reframe, to think about this by offering some tips for being anti-racist educators. And so the first tip is to examine the historical roots and contemporary manifestations of prejudice and discrimination. And so really what this has to do with is understanding and acknowledging racism in your specific discipline. How does that show up, right? And understanding the ways that racism impacts the Black students in your discipline. It also encompasses exploring the influence of race and culture on one's own personal and professional attitudes and behavior. And so what this does, this tip requires that we have an understanding of culture. So how do we define culture? Well, culture is defined as a dynamic system of social values, of cognitive codes, of behavioral standards, of worldviews and beliefs that we use to give meaning in order to our own lives and the lives of others. And so culture is something that is learned, it is communicated, it is layered, it is lived, right? So it influences how we think, how we learn, and it influences our behavior, and it influences consequently how we teach. And so culture matters, and it's important to understand that everyone has culture. No one is acultural. So as faculty and staff in post-secondary environments, it's really important that we understand how culture and our students' culture affect the whole educational process. Identifying and counteracting biases and stereotyping in learning materials. So again, this comes in thinking about how we come to this work in our frames of reference, right? So we need to think about, what does our curriculum look like? And how does the curriculum that we choose empower all of our students? The fourth tip, dealing with racial tensions and conflicts. So how do we deal with racial conflicts when they occur in our classrooms? So myself and Dr. Brian McGowan, who is also a professor here at American University in the School of Education, and 2 other colleagues wrote a paper about Black faculty engaging in difficult dialogues in the college classroom. And in this paper, we talked about the importance of faculty prioritizing and facilitating discussions about racism and racial violence with students, both undergraduate and graduate students. And so we found 4 salient things were really important to help us to deal with racial tensions and conflicts. And one of those was making sure that we really were deliberate and intentional in our preparation as faculty to be able to deal with these types of tensions when they arose in the classroom. It's also important that we were connecting current events on racism and racial violence to our classroom lessons. And we also found it really important that we had a plan, like a plan for dealing with classroom management and how we're going to make decisions, when these instances arose. And then finally, it was important to have just a community of peers, trusted peers that we could rely on, because as we all know, this work is ongoing and it's tiring, right? Not only for our students, but for us. And so having peers that we could rely on to do this work. The 5th tip, identifying appropriate anti-racist resources to incorporate into the curriculum in different ways. And so what does that mean, right? And so for us, it's thinking about, again, how can we best support students through our curricular choices that are both inclusive and expansive? Developing new approaches to teaching children using varying cognitive approaches to diverse learning styles. So here, again, thinking about what are our instructional strategies and how effective is our instruction for diverse learning styles? The next strategy, identifying appropriate assessment and placement procedures and practices. So again, this requires us to think about the alignment of our assessment with the inclusive and anti-racist policies that we have for our classroom, for our departments, and for our colleges, right? Assessing the hidden curriculum and making it more inclusive and reflective of all students' experiences. And this requires that we make sure that we are transparent in our communication with students, and that we're also engaging in multiple ways with students and communicating with them, and not just taking a one-size-fits-all approach in terms of communicating with our students to make sure that they are academically successful. And the final tip, ensuring that personnel practices and policies are consistent with equity goals, and that they provide faculty with the knowledge and skills to implement equity programs. And so really what this requires us, again, is to think about what are our inclusive anti-racist policies, and how do they guide our classrooms, our departments, or our colleges, and making sure that the faculty or staff are equipped with the knowledge and skills to appropriately carry out the policies that we have in place. And so, these are not prescriptive, but they are just tips to help us to think about if we want to move towards, in continuing in our goals of being anti-racist or inclusive, to help to guide us with this. And so, as we think about being inclusive and anti-racist, how do we keep ourselves accountable? So again, many of you have heard me say throughout this workshop that this work is ongoing, and it is, right? And so how do we as faculty and staff hold ourselves accountable for creating and sustaining anti-racist environments, right? And so once we leave this, this workshop, there's still work to be done. How are we going to hold ourselves accountable in doing this work? And so I pose this question: how do or will we ensure that we don't continue familiar practices that are counter to doing anti-racist work? And so I think that I've heard all of you, and so I will opt in this session to not break us out into breakout rooms, but to maybe try to see and just keep us in a whole group and see, just take some responses. So how are we feeling about this question? What does everyone think? I mean, workshops are always so wonderful. I always feel motivated and empowered to just try to save the world, especially, Black students in STEM. But how do we make sure that we don't continue our familiar practices? And I can't see many of you, so I'm going to monitor the chat. Please, share responses in the chat, however you feel most comfortable.
I'm thinking of, talking to our, I think our program is doing this I'm in the theater program, just talking about things at a curricular level, like how we're just looking at the curriculum. Because if I'm tasked to teach a white canon with Shakespeare and other certain time periods, what are we requiring our students to take, and kind of going to those roots, I think. It's just something that's on my mind, which obviously takes a lot of hard work and time.
Yes.
Yeah. For me, also in theater, the interrogation of sort of, you were talking earlier about sort of looking at yourself, but sort of the interrogation of everything I say and everything I do, because I've grown up a certain way, I've been built a certain way, and as I am in a sort of a couple of years now of radical learning and trying to grow and let things go and learn more ways of viewing things, how do I balance doing new things in new ways while still bringing the value that I have as a teacher and the skill set that I've developed over a long career? To what is the balance between those? And so just committing to make that that examination of my ways of working part of every day and every class.
From a student perspective, if you will, I had an experience in one of my courses at SIS. One of my professors, it was the first time I'd actually seen it done in any of my graduate coursework. One of my professors was very intentional, and when she was presenting the readings that we had for the week, she would, in all of her presentations, she would have a photo of the scholars that she was referencing. And one of the things that she said was that was her way of holding herself accountable, right? And she was talking about like how if like who am I pulling into this course? Like, am I elevating the voices of scholars of color? Am I being inclusive in my own practice, right? And so that was her way of kind of holding herself accountable. And that's something that I really, it made an impact on me. I was like, oh, this person is actually really holding themselves accountable. So just that little small thing, but it was like, okay, am I constantly putting in your face a particular voice from a particular scholarly work, or am I trying to really diversify the voices that I am bringing into this, and amplifying their voices? So I thought that was really cool.
Any other thoughts about how we will hold ourselves accountable?
I appreciate the opportunity to learn about resources that other professors are using, and I'm happy to share the ones that I use. And perhaps there's already a hub or a mechanism or a way to benefit from materials that others are using and perhaps share some and have more conversations like this one.
Yes.
I'm not a professor at AU. I'm a staff member, but I've taught a couple courses internationally, and I taught an intercultural communications course when I was in Hong Kong, and I think it really helped me recognize how important it is to be dedicated to understanding, like you were talking about, culturally contextual information. And it's just like, when it's outside of your immediate identity or proximity, having people work with you to develop that course or that curriculum, that it is more authentic to them, perhaps, and that it translates well to a diverse set of audience, so that the course is truly inclusive. And I think it was a lot more work, being that I wasn't wholly familiar with the nuances of the student group that I was teaching. And I really appreciated that opportunity.
I agree. I mean, and I really appreciate, many of you sharing some of the things that you've done and that you continue to do, and being willing to do this. I see there's some people asking questions, and there's some really good responses here in the chat, asking questions and lessening assumptions. Yes. Someone says, perhaps set up an accountability process where we have discussions maybe twice a semester with other faculty about what we are or can do to embody anti-racism. I love this. And actually, we may be closer to this than you think. So stay tuned for this year. And so I really appreciate all of these, your responses and your participation. I want to share something with you to further to help you, or just to support you in this process. And so these are some commitments, and help it to guide our thinking about how do we not only create but sustain anti-racist workplaces or classrooms, right? Because this is applicable to whatever role that you have. And so just want to share a few things with us as we come to the end of this session to help us to continue to doing this work. Because again, this work is ongoing, right? And so it's really important. Some of you mentioned this, right? And so some of us are already doing this. So it's really important that we notice the number of students who are white and Black in our classrooms, right? It's important that we do this. Oftentimes, sometimes we may see that people will adopt a colorblind ideology, but it's important that we see students, right? And that we do recognize the number of students who are white and Black, because we have to be intentional in our efforts, right? So if we're intentionally working to support our students and all of our students, we have to notice who our students are. We need to monitor participation patterns by race and ethnicity, right? And so, what does this mean? I mean, do all of the white men students dominate this discussion? Are the Black and Latino students reluctant to speak? So we need to monitor these participation patterns. We need to assess complex questions, right? Who are we directing complex questions to? All right, and who are we directing the more factual questions to, right? We need to assess our assumptions about performance and engagement based on race and ethnicity. What are our biases and our assumptions about the performance of our students based on race and ethnicity? We need to think about that, right? We need to avoid pedagogical practices that result in the exclusion of minoritized students from groups such as Black students or Latino students. And we need to monitor our student attendance, homework, and test and quiz performance by race and ethnicity to identify patterns that can really provide insights into the experiences of our students. Oftentimes we find ourselves saying, I don't know why all of the Black students, and I'll take myself, are not doing well in chemistry, right? So maybe monitoring the student attendance, the homework, and test quiz could help to provide some insights into this. And so in our remaining 1 minute, I would like to thank all of you for taking time out of your afternoon. I know many of you attended numerous other workshops. Thank you today for attending this one. And if you want to continue to have conversations about this, please do. The Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning here at American University is a wonderful place to do that. Please stay tuned for our CPTL series, which will be kicked off this fall. Join us for our Ann Farron conference and our May faculty workshops. It has been wonderful.
If I may just add quickly, if everybody would just take a minute to fill out the evaluation. I pasted the link in the chat box. It's really short, so it would help us out immensely. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for doing that. Yes, and so again, I've been honored to be your facilitator and learning with you today. I look forward to addressing any questions. My email is here, so if you would like to reach out and do that, please feel free to do that. And as I may be on campus, or many of us will be on campus, this year, it would be wonderful to see you in a socially distanced way. And so thank you again for joining.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thanks, stay well.
You do the same.
Thank you.
Absolutely.